Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. And welcome to the CPhI webinar, The Future of Biomanufacturing, Capacity, Capability, and Careers. My name is James, Senior Content Producer at Pharma Markets, and I'll be your moderator today. We have a few announcements before we begin. Nextly, we have our two speakers today, Eric Langer and Killian Driscoll, and this will be followed by a Q&A at the very end. So our first speaker of today is, of course, Eric Langer, President and Managing Partner of Bioplanet Associates. Eric has over 20 years of experience in biotech and life science international marketing, market assessment, and publishing, and has held senior management and marketing positions at biopharmaceutical supply companies. So, Eric, over to you, and best of luck.
Thank you so much, James. I appreciate the introduction. I look forward to the opportunity to explain some of the data that we've collected over, not just over this year or during the pandemic, which we will, but also over the last nearly 20 years. We've been evaluating this industry and the trends, because now we're in a very disruptive situation with COVID, of course. And the question that on many people's minds is, how will capacity, how will the supply chain, and how will careers be affected by much of the changes that we're seeing? So I want to start with looking at one of the questions we ask in our annual study, which is, what's the single most important biomanufacturing trend we see? And this year, as you can well imagine, you see 23% of the industry is saying our biggest problem right now is materials, sourcing and raw materials. But what you could also look at the other side and say 76% of the industry is not considering material sourcing as a major challenge. So when we look at this in terms of the overall trend over the last 8 years here, you can see that, for example, a number of the trend lines are going down. Like, for example, strangely enough, manufacturing productivity and efficiency was a key trend back in 2014, 8 years ago. Now it's gone down year after year as the industry has essentially become normalized to the expectation that manufacturing productivity and efficiency is not a trend. I think that's the key point here. It's not a trend, it's now an expectation. So by definition, a trend, of course, is something that we see as something that is novel and emerging. These things we're seeing here, for example, single-use systems. That kind of implementation is showing, back 8 years, frankly, even before that, it was a major trend. But now we're looking at it and seeing it in 2022, single-use systems is virtually nobody sees that as a major trend. Same thing for manufacturing productivity and efficiency. You can see the last year during COVID, that number bumped a little bit, but you can see we're back on that declining trend line where those two things, which are key right now in our pandemic situation, are in fact declining. Whereas things like viral and gene therapy, those still continue to be a major issue. By the way, this all comes from our annual report. I'm showing you preliminary data from our 19th annual report, which is not out yet. It'll probably come out they're typically produced in April, end of April. So the numbers I'm showing here we're still in data collection phase. But right now we've got about 150 biopharmas and CDMOs responding, and about 120 industry suppliers separately from around the world. So what we're seeing, and we do this every year, what we're seeing is a trend line analysis based on the world's experiences in bioprocessing. We also cover a analysis, obviously, of the long-term effects of COVID on bioprocessing. What we're seeing here is essentially the fact that COVID has accelerated, in some cases dramatically accelerated, the trends which were existing before. And if you recall that adoption of single-use technology data point, where we saw it just drop off to zero practically, that is just another example of where COVID, had it not been for COVID, the trend lines would have been declining or increasing. But with COVID, we see a rapid uptick as a result because of the necessity to make these changes. In terms of COVID, some of the long-term effects we're seeing by biopharma, by the biopharma innovators themselves, 70% of them have said they're going to be doing more outsourcing. 60% are going to be doing more changes in their supply chain, and 50% are going to be doing more regionalization, which means more sourcing globally, for example, more focus on the development of capabilities in various regions to be able to do the production, much of which is centering around the need to provide a more robust supply chain and recognition that we are clearly a global industry that has supply chain challenges. So these will absolutely affect other parts and pieces of the industry. And we'll give you one example in a moment about how, just as an example, cell culture, media, and buffer outsourcing has actually significantly changed as a result. What we want to do, though, is look at where future actions, because this is all going to be a question of action. You can have an opinion, but what will actually be done? So this year we asked what future actions, what steps your facilities would take to address the supply chain security issues. And what we found was essentially some pretty critical issues like validating additional bioprocessing suppliers. 76% of the industry is going to be validating additional bioprocessing suppliers. You may say, big deal, so somebody gets validated. But in this industry, for decades, literally, in order to become a supplier in this industry, you had to become validated, of course. You can't just say, it's not like software where you say, I've got a great idea, why don't you go ahead and plug it in? It doesn't work that way. You cannot plug yourself into a GMP environment. So a big first step in this industry to create an opportunity for a new supplier means they need to be validated. And what we're seeing here is a very significant percentage of the industry is going to be doing just that if they're not doing it already. What that means then is we're going to see more suppliers coming into the industry. And what more suppliers mean when they're coming into the industry, of course, means we're going to start seeing additional competition, which we're not seeing right now during COVID. So a big question right now that we'll be seeing in the next 2 to 5 years is how will these additionally validated suppliers play out? We're seeing secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary suppliers, fourth level suppliers that never would have seen the light of day are now being considered because the biopharma industry is short of suppliers and they're short of equipment. So as a result of that, we're seeing the possibilities that we're going to have greater price competition coming up, and we're also going to see more innovation. And I think that last one is the really interesting part. A lot of times the innovation in this industry comes from the smaller suppliers, and those smaller suppliers then create an opportunity for better, new, more efficient bioprocessing. So in a way, this acceleration of the trends has shaken the tree and in bioprocessing has created some opportunities that otherwise would not have existed. Another one, identifying new sources of raw materials. That's both for the suppliers themselves as well as for the end users. They're out there with their radar up, looking for things that are solutions. Looking for more local suppliers, more dual sourcing. All of this stuff is coming as a result of the necessity brought on by the pandemic. We're also seeing some issues like some companies are now using what they have more efficiently. We're hearing stories like for media prep, for example. The fact that we're short of single-use technologies means that the media prep in many of the facilities is not being undertaken very efficiently, and they don't have the single-use devices necessary to make make enough product. So they're short. What happens then, of course, is the decision makers or the operators are now saying, we got to do this more efficiently, and they're squeezing more efficiency out of the products and devices and the steps that they have. So there are some very significant shifts going to be derived as a result of this. Changing tack a little bit, bringing back that issue of innovation. What novel processes and innovative process are being evaluated in the next 12 months? This is a question where we're trying to identify where innovation in bioprocessing will ultimately be taking place. What we see very often in the industry is this is a very, very curious industry. The industry participants love the novel technologies and novel ideas. Always scientific curiosity comes up. The question is, can it actually be implemented in a GMP environment? And that's, of course, a major challenge. So rather than looking at what's being looked at or considered as novel, what novelty is out there, what we want to do is what's actually being undertaken in terms of a hard evaluation in the next 12 months. In other words, what are the biopharma facilities actually looking at right now or over the next 12 months? And we can see here that in our preliminary data with an N of over 100, upstream continuous bioprocessing and perfusion bioreactors are a hot topic right now. 44% are actually looking at those as an innovative operation that they may be considering adopting in the near future. Other upstream continuous bioprocesses other than continuous. So again, manufacturing platform shows up. Downstream, we're looking at novel chromatography resins, and we're looking at alternatives to continuous purification, like multi-column chromatography, simulated moving bed sort of technologies. That kind of technology is incredibly complicated when you get more than 2 or 3 columns, and that to be able to simplify that is going to require things like automation. It's going to require things like training and so forth. So a lot of this stuff needs to be developed not as an integrated process rather than simply little bits and pieces. So you can't have a perfusion bioreactor without having the corollary downstream simulated moving bed or a multi-column chromatography unit operation. It doesn't work well to just replace one step in what's supposed to be a continuous process. I mentioned media outsourcing. 23% are considering media outsourcing. 23, almost the same number are considering outsourcing buffers, which 3 years ago, 5 years ago, that number would have been very small. When we evaluated it, it would have been certainly in single digits. But during COVID, we're seeing some very significant shifts there, and I'll show you in a second some of the implications there. What we do see, though, is not implementing any truly novel technologies. 4.5%, 95% of this industry actively evaluates new technologies at their facility. That is what I would call a growing and learning industry segment. So back to the point of novel technologies I made in buffers and media outsourcing. Back just last year, 2 years ago, it was, like I said, in single digits. Last year, during COVID, we're looking at 11 or 12 versus 16% for media outsourcing. This year, it's gone up, as I noted, to 22 to 23% are evaluating the possibilities of outsourcing media and buffer. Keep in mind that this involves shipping WIFI, water for injection, great distances, which to many people's minds makes no sense. Why pay those kinds of ridiculous shipping charges? But the fact that we're during COVID need to accelerate and evaluate alternatives to processing means that this becomes a possibility. And that, I think, is rather interesting. This slide doesn't overlay right. The example I wanted to bring up was back in 2009. I was having a conversation with somebody very recently on single-use technologies. During the H1N1 flu, we saw that the industry saw implementation of single-use technologies really bump up. Back in 2009, those who were using it saw this as a possibility that they're going to need to consider, never declined again. That was the terminology we got. And that was the effect we also saw. So 11, 12, 13 years ago, the concept of single use was pretty much fetal bovine serum in a plastic bag. It was moving in that direction. All of a sudden, it made sense, especially when we were talking about this kind of a technology, and it never declined. We're going to see that kind of a shift in areas that we haven't quite evaluated yet. So the impact of COVID is not quite over in terms of improvements. New expenditures. This is getting a little even more nitty-gritty. Where are people actually spending more money in this area? And what we found so far is that single-use bioreactors and cell culture media and other single-use disposable technologies are really bumping up. More money is being spent on these, not unexpectedly. Part of this is due to the fact that single-use technologies are in short supply, so discounting is going away. So the expenditures, the volume may not be going up, but the expenditures on bioreactors and other single-use technologies may be going up. The cell culture media here, we don't quite have an analysis on why that might be. Why are people spending more on media? It's our only thought right now, and we'll analyze that when we write this up. May well be that cell culture media is being stockpiled, dry powder media potentially, in the event that there may be shortages. To the extent that if 38% of this increase was due to hoarding, stockpiling, or warehousing, then that means there's going to be a drawdown as a result of this number next year, for example. So this number may drop way down. The other one here, automation software, this one here is not going to be going away. That automation and software expenditure, what people are actually spending money on, that is a continuing, ongoing trend, and that we'll see continue because it affects more than just automation of the whole process. It enables things like continuous downstream processing. So when you see these kinds of components connect like this, automation with continuous, you can sort of unravel a story that's going on right there. Of course, we could probably tell stories about each of these data points. And by the way, there are about 500 pages of these graphs in the report. So, bring a cup of tea with you if you decide you're going to pick that one up. Sourcing, COVID-19 is increasing that different thinking. And some of the sourcing options and the manufacturing options, much of which goes to outsourcing. And I would say that the COVID-19 impact that we mentioned before, the 70% expecting more outsourcing, is going to definitely, and it already has affected, the CMO part of this industry. The ability to produce a vaccine is obviously the COVID function. But the reason that it affects all CDMOs is not just because if you're not having anything to do at all with the COVID therapies or the COVID vaccines, if you're a second-tier manufacturer, because the large-scale manufacturers are focusing on vaccine production, then the projects that would otherwise have gone to those larger CDMOs are now going to second-tier CDMOs, filling their dance card. Second-tier CDMO projects going down even one step further. So even smaller facilities have are being inundated and stretched to their capacity limits. Innovative technology like cell and gene therapy, people don't have options there. They're going to have to produce using a CDMO that has that experience. So those, just as an example, are areas where CDMOs have become integral to this industry segment. In fact, they're so integral that, and we've seen this over time, that over time, the percentage of facilities that are not outsourcing has gone from 60% back 15, 18 years ago, of the facilities did all of their manufacturing in-house. Today, it's more like 30% or less that are doing all their manufacturing in-house. So 70% of the manufacturers today versus 30% 15 years ago are now manufacturing using an outsourced facility for some of their production. And even still, even with that, we're seeing capacity problems. A little difficult to see on this chart, but over the years, you'll see that the question for this this slide was, I believe our facility is experiencing production capacity constraints today. Back in 2004, well, you can see that on the up here, this is severe or significant constraints. Last year, we saw it looking more or less like this, but you can see that we're moving closer. Even pre-COVID, we were moving closer to capacity constraints. Back in 2004, this was a major, big issue. People literally not being able to produce and being bought by others because the product needed to be produced. So companies would be going out of business or being subsumed by others because they could not produce their product. So, and that created obviously great disruption. That was then, this is now. Today, there's a decade and a half worth of experience to be able to manage capacity more efficiently and be able to run just-in-time inventory and so forth. But it still doesn't mean that that you can move into this industry segment expecting to be able to run just-in-time inventory and then have a pandemic loaded on top of you. That's what's creating much of the problems today. I think, frankly, the fact that this industry has been able to produce as effectively as it has during a COVID is a testimony to the resilience, the flexibility, and to a large extent, the dedication of the people that are actually involved in doing this production. This is pretty remarkable that we've been able to do this and still produce those oncology drugs at the level that we always have. Yeah, we're seeing problems with single-use tubing, not enough of that, not enough raw materials for buffers and so forth. But the reality is there are relatively few instances where products are absolutely getting shut down, which is pretty remarkable. Going international. One of the issues we see is many of the facilities as a result of COVID are increasing their offshoring. So whereas we've seen this percentage of offshoring over the next 5 years going up year after year, it's only going to be accelerating as a result of COVID. In terms of hiring, one of the biggest problems in this industry segment is hiring the right people at the right time. And that's been a major challenge for 15 years. It's only getting worse. And when we asked where the budget, because where the money is obviously where there's a problem. Well, the question here is, where is a change in budget over the next 12 months? And we found when you add expecting large 20% or moderate 10% increases, we see that 43% of the industry is planning on increasing their budgets rather significantly for hiring new operations staff, which means this is part of the challenge where the capacity is exceeding the ability to staff a facility. It's not about raw material. It's not about bricks and mortar. It's not about single-use bioreactors. It's about, do we have the operations or scientific staff to be able to actually do the job? And in addition, when you think about all these people who are being hired, we're looking at training for operations staff. You recognize you bring a new person into a GMP environment. That is not an easy situation to be in. I was just talking with a bioprocessing professional in the Maryland area, and they were talking about the Great Retirement, which I hadn't really heard before. We've all heard about the Great resignation. And I'd heard that there was a situation where people were retiring, but 20% of this person's staff during COVID retired, which means 1 in 5 position is now open, which means you're going to have to bring people up into an open position. And the problem here is you're not just bringing random people in. You're bringing in, you're replacing people with 20 plus years of experience with people that may have limited experience. And that is going to, again, be a capacity constraining event. That's probably going to be one of the major ones that we continue to see and experience as this industry goes forward. Cell therapy, even worse. Cell therapy, hiring more staff in cell and gene therapy, over 50% are experiencing that kind of problem. So we're seeing this kind of a challenge, not just in an individual area, but across all sorts of areas in bioprocessing and elsewhere on the science side, centering around hiring, centering around training. Areas where hiring difficulties exist, which of the job descriptions at your facility are most difficult? Once again, we're seeing year after year, we're seeing process development up and downstream staff. They don't exist. If you can't develop your process, it's not going to be possible to produce a product. So these are capacity limiting issues. And then, so just in summary, just to confirm what we've said, COVID-19 is absolutely accelerating these trends. We're going to be seeing more suppliers, more outsourcing, more regionalization, and fortunately more efficiency as bioprocessing gets smarter. And we're going to see it in small ways and large ways, but it's not going to be without its growing pains. Emerging foreign markets are increasingly becoming an option. Some of the data show, for example, that China as an outsourcing destination, which never existed 8 years ago as a consideration really, is now a viable option, partially because of COVID, partially because of the rapid development in that area and others. Hiring the right staff is a chronic problem. It's not going away, and it likely won't go away. The question will be, how can the industry create a rapidly developed, flexible education and training resources program capable of meeting those very critical long-term needs? So I think we're going to be doing questions for the end. Is that right?
Yes, Eric, it is. And thank you very much for the informative talk. It was very insightful. So everybody, move on to the second part of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Killian, who's the Director of Projects at the National Institute for Bioprocessing Research and Training. Killian's role includes working closely with stakeholders in the biopharma industry and has been involved in the successful establishment of the NIRBT, which has numerous international accolades, including the ISPE Faculty of the Year. So, Killian, over to you, and good luck.
Great. Thanks, James, for that introduction, and thank you, Eric, for your talk. I'm going to pick up on a couple of the matters that Eric introduced. Particularly, I'm going to talk about workforce development. So, there's 3 things that I'm going to look at. Number 1 is the global demand for talent. Eric talked about that this has always been an issue over the last 15 years, and it's getting progressively more of an acute challenge, so we'll explore that. We also want to explore why this is happening. Eric talked about the impact of COVID, and that's a key component, but there's other components as well, which are driving the talent demand. And then, of course, what we all want to hear on kind of a forum like this is, well, what's a potential solution? So how can we meet the demand? I'll give a couple of case studies from my own organisation, NIBRT, which is based in Dublin in Ireland. And I'll also reference some initiatives that I'm aware of in other jurisdictions. So hopefully that's of use for people. Okay, so let's get underway. So the global demand for biopharma talent. There was a great piece of work published in the Financial Times last year in 2021 involving Cytiva, and they interviewed over 1,100 senior execs from global biopharma organizations to really assess the resilience of their supply chain. And they looked at a wide variety of different aspects, such as the supply chain itself, talent, the R&D ecosystem, manufacturing agility, government policy and regulation, etc. So many of the issues that Eric talked about. And what came out as the weakest link throughout all those various different components was talent, was access to talent, retaining talent, growing talent. So 25% of respondents said that sourcing of talent is a substantial or very substantial issue, and then 50% saying that the cost of talent is becoming a key issue. So let's have a look at some other geographies. This is you've seen this slide before, or a similar slide. This is what Eric would have presented when he kindly shared this slide with me previously. This is from their 2020 report, which is available, and the 2020 or the 2022 report will be released, I think Eric said, sometime in May. And again, it's talking about the job positions that are most of a challenge to fill. And again, consistency there around process development, upstream processing, process engineers, downstream processing, etc. And we'll go into the reasons for that in a few slides. So if we look at a couple of, that's the, I suppose, the global view, then let's look at a couple of locations just to see maybe what local trends are. So the UK are near neighbours here to Ireland. Very strong history and legacy in life sciences, not so much on the manufacturing side, more on the discovery side. A very interesting report from the UK government published just late last year, early this year, looking forward to 2030, and they're predicting that there will be 1,033 new jobs across the life sciences sector in that time frame. So a huge talent gap emerging within the UK, driven by, we've heard it before, the great retirement, as Eric mentioned, but also by the fundamental growth of the industry. And we'll look at the factors driving the growth shortly. Boston, to many people, the hub of biopharma for really since the inception of the industry back in the mid 80s. Great report published in the Boston Globe just in January, and who would have thought it? People have been quoted saying statements like it's almost like in Massachusetts there's too many biotechs. You can't walk 2 blocks around Kendall Square without receiving a job offer. And that's fundamentally driving competitiveness within the industry within Boston. And we can see some of the factors there: 16.5% voluntary staff turnover, very significant average scientific salaries, title inflation. So fantastic if you're trying to develop your career within biopharma, but a challenge to the companies and to their longevity and to their sustainability also. And again, it's not just restricted to the hotspots within the UK, within East Coast, West Coast, US. It's really across the globe. North Carolina produced a similar report. And again, the link is there for those who want to do a deep dive into it. South Korea, really interesting. So Eric talked about how companies are pivoting and outsourcing more and more. And what we're seeing in South Korea is the emergence of very strong global outsourcing players. Celltrion, for example, Samsung also in particular. So look at the level of investment that Celltrion is planning over the next period. And one organization, Celltrion, looking to employ 110,000 people. Unbelievable, up to 2030. We also mentioned China and a trend that wouldn't have been there 10 years ago. 5 years ago, people outsourcing to China, but as the capability increases within China and as the capacity impacts other regions, we're seeing companies such as Wuxi expanding very rapidly from obviously a very modest 5,000 litres of capacity now to over 270,000 litres of capacity. And indeed, they've made very significant investments here in Ireland, including the world's largest single-use manufacturing centre. So companies, Wuxi going from strength to strength. Okay, so I think we've proven that there's a strong and growing and acute demand for talent. But why? What's what's driving it? What are the reasons? So if we want to address this, we really need to fundamentally understand the reasons why. So in this slide, what I've kind of broken it down into is what I would describe as kind of three main categories. There are global trends, there's trends that are inherent to biopharma, inherent growth itself, and there's also trends within the advanced manufacturing sphere. And again, Eric referenced that, what was it? 95% plus companies are trialing new technologies within their manufacturing operations. So within global trends, we're going to talk about things about the reskilling revolution. We're talking about the decline of vocational education. We're talking about kind of perception about working in manufacturing, obviously the impact of COVID, geopolitical economic developments, sustainability, population, longevity are all factors. And what we'll do is we'll focus on one. We'll focus on reskilling revolution. If we look at biopharma growth, we're looking at an unprecedented time within the industry. What we're seeing is an unprecedented diversity in the range and type and indeed clinical efficacy of the types of products that are coming through the pipeline, and we'll talk about that. And then in advanced manufacturing, again, Eric outlined the very many different types, whether it's new chromatography systems, whether it's continuous manufacturing, whether it's single-use systems, whether it's digitization. So we'll just focus on one. We'll focus on the applicability of Industry 4.0 technologies to biopharma manufacturing and how that's driving the acute talent demand. Okay, so having a look at global trends and the reskilling revolution. World Economic Forum tends to take a step back, looks at key macroeconomic, political, geopolitical trends over a 5 or 10 year period, and published a very interesting report in 2019 called Towards a Reskilling Revolution. And within that, they said that by 2022, so by the end of this year, the core skills required to perform most jobs globally will change by 42%. So that's a fundamental shift in how we all work. And to drive that by 2022, everybody will require an additional 101 days of learning, which again is a fundamental shift to how we work. And you can see within the slide where they're talking about kind of the growing skill sets and the declining skill sets. So across all industries, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift. Now, if we look within biopharma, what is really interesting is my organization, Nibert, was set up really it came out as an idea. The catalyst of an idea came in the early 2000s, because at that stage, when we looked at the strategy of the industry, we saw that drug products coming through the pipeline, small molecules still very dominant, but we were beginning to see an emergence of recombinant proteins, molecular biology, monoclonal antibodies. And now as we look almost 20 years later, we're seeing a similar inflection point within the industry. We're seeing an incredible diversity and range in the types of products that are coming through. Great report published just late last year from FPM, looking at the types of approvals that are coming through the pipeline within the European system. And what you can see there is that 48% of the approvals are for new products, the balance being for new indications of existing products. So that's a very significant shift. When what we're seeing in that is 41% of the approvals coming through are for orphan drugs, so for rare and ultra rare diseases. And again, how do you manufacture those products which are particularly unique? And then what is particularly interesting is on the right hand side, the final circle there shows that 37% of products are small molecule, and the manufacturing of that is well established. 56% monoclonals, and a variety of different type of monoclonals. We're seeing increased complexity within that. But in the, kind of the smaller little segments there, that's where we're seeing the diversity beginning to come through in cell therapies, gene therapies, and other technologies. And again, a second nice slide from FBA where they look forward and they project forward about what types of drug products might come through the pipeline in the short to medium term. And we're seeing some really interesting technologies. CAR-Ts for solid tumors. Obviously, they have had extraordinary clinical efficacy for blood tumors, but a complex supply chain and a complex manufacturing process. We're seeing exosomes technology, gene editing technology, more complex MABs, bispecifics, trispecifics, monoclonal fragments, etc., etc. So what we're seeing is that there's a demand for operators, technicians, scientists, engineers, process development folks, R&D folks who fundamentally understand this diversification and how to take it from bench to scale to GMP to the clinician. Now, aligned to that, what we're seeing also is the ongoing growth in biopharma manufacturing. And actually, these slides predicted the growth of biopharma manufacturing, and this was just prior to COVID. So the slide is probably out of date, and the bar charts will have grown significantly since then. But a good approximate for the amount of sales from biopharma is around 300 billion per annum, growing at 12%. The demand for manufacturing capacity, as Eric has outlined, is increasing very significantly, and we're seeing that companies developing their own capacity, but outsourcing more and more as well. Okay, so again, we're seeing global trends, we're seeing trends in diversification of the types of products, we're seeing growth in capacity, and we're also seeing increased complexity in the manufacturing process itself. So as a research and training organization, we deal with a lot of biopharma manufacturing organizations and a lot of vendor organizations. And Eric rightly pointed out that a lot of the manufacturing innovation in this industry is driven by innovative vendors. And 5-6 years ago, if I had put up something around biopharma manufacturing in the future, I probably would have been talking about kind of single-use systems, perhaps more intensive upstream processing or more intensive downstream processing. But now what we're seeing is a whole plethora of technologies, some taken from other sectors, such as the automotive sector or the aeronautical sector, who have particularly applied for Industry 4.0 technologies, digital transformation techniques to their sectors. And now we're seeing if that can be applied within the highly regulated biopharma manufacturing sector. So again, I think Eric mentioned about the skills, about the importance of investment in automation, and that's something we're seeing very strongly. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how the facilities are designed away from your traditional six-pack, large-scale stainless steel. What we are seeing now is facilities which are multi-purpose, multi-product, modular in basis. Everything on skids, new technology can be rolled in, can be rolled out, configurable, etc. All still within the parameters of GMP and the regulatory restrictions that also particularly apply. So there's no doubt what we are seeing is that those people who work within biopharma manufacturing now also have to have this particular type of skill set. And this is a great example of it. A client approached me a short time ago and said this was a gene therapy company, and they were struggling to fulfill this particular role. They were struggling to get candidates for this role. Could we help and assist them? So it was for a biopharma automation engineer within a gene therapy facility. And if you look down at what the skill sets that is required by the company, and then if we look by the qualification and experience that's required, engineering degree, 5 years experience, automation experience, drug substance experience, GMP experience, that is an awful lot of expertise to reside in one particular individual. So it's a good example for why these individuals are rare and why it's a challenge to get these individuals. So what can we do about it? What potential solutions are out there? So again, let's have a look back at the World Economic Forum towards the Reskilling Revolution report. And you'll remember where they said that 42% of skills were going to fundamentally change. So all of us will require 101 days of learning. And then they looked, well, what's the most appropriate way to drive these solutions in a cost-effective manner? They said if companies try and do this, and often that's the first port of call, a company will be building a new facility or developing a new product line, and they say, right, I need 20 operators, 20 technicians, 5 engineers, I need people in MS&T, I need some process development folks. They'll go out with a very short-term, targeted campaign to try and recruit those people in. And that'll be effective, and sometimes they'll pull them from other competitors and prices will rise, as we've seen in Boston. So if companies do it alone, it's around 25% effective. If they collaborate together, the effectiveness rises to 45%. If companies go to government and say, you need to drive this across your education system, you see a 77% effectiveness. But where it's at its most effective is where you have a tri-party collaboration between industry, between government, between academia, to take a holistic, long-term approach to addressing this. The effectiveness rises up to 90%. So what I want to talk about is a few examples that I'm aware of who have not cracked this, but who have made progress in cracking this. So you'll forgive me, but the first case study is from my own organization, NIBRT, the National Institute for Bioprocessing Research and Training, based in Dublin in Ireland. And as I mentioned, back in the 2000s, the Irish government saw that there was a shift from small molecules towards monoclonals and biologics, and they said, right, we are going to establish a research and training facility to train the workforce of the future. And in fairness to them, they invested very significantly. They invested 57 million euros to establish this research and training centre, 6,500 square metres. And we've been delighted with the success that we've had from NIBRT. We train over 4,500 people each year, with a focus on the Irish market, but very international focus also, and I'll talk about that. And in parallel to that, we have seen over the last decade a really strong growth in biopharma manufacturing within Ireland, over $10 billion of capital investment, in excess of 10,000 new jobs, that's direct jobs, and probably the same number again in supporting jobs. You can see the level of investments there, just some examples from last year. And then a nice quote from a gentleman called Brendan McGrath, who heads up WUSHI in Ireland. And he talks that they've been able to recruit all the talent that they require to date, thanks to the education system in Ireland and thanks to NIBRT. And you contrast that with kind of some of the quotes about walking 2 blocks around Kendall Square. So access to talent is just a fundamental. So we recognize that not one organization can resolve this growing global issue. So we have a partners program where we work with, and you can see some of our partners there. So with JIB, which is the Jefferson Institute for Bioprocessing in Philadelphia, a new organization called CASTLE, the Canadian Alliance for Skills and Training in Life Sciences. Down in Australia, we work with the University of Technology in Sydney, in Guangzhou in China, and we have a training facility there, and also just announced last year the establishment of Korean NIBRT. We talked earlier on about Celltrion and Samsung. So we have essentially this network of franchisees or partners who have the NIBRT curriculum, who can deliver it within their training facilities, again, to a global audience. And that's a process that's working well. And again, to make sure that we can reach out to a global audience, we have launched the NIBRT Online Academy. I think there's there was over 10,000 people that subscribed to that in 66 different countries. A lot of free content on that. So if anyone on this call is interested in developing their own skills in biopharma, just go up onto noa.nibrt.ie, and you'll find a range of kind of e-learning modules there. A good proportion of them are free of charge, and then there's some that are charged as well. So again, a good way to develop your skills, and of course that's available software as a service across the globe. Just in the interest of time, I won't spend too much about talking about all the various different things we do in workforce development, but I think it's safe to say is that if you want to address this issue, you need a long-term strategy, and it has to be holistic. You can't just look at that one client and say, they want to hire 5 engineers and 10 operators, let's sort that out. You need to look at the industry in totality. So you need to look at your community college system, you need to look at your university system, you need to look at other industries that are perhaps from a manufacturing base that may be declining. People with their great skills, can they be cross-skilled and re-skilled? You need to look at equality, diversity, and inclusiveness, people from other sectors. You need to look at the population of immigrants coming into the country, how you can build and sustain that. So it's really a holistic approach to addressing the particular needs. And also very keen to say is that, I focused on my own organization, NIBRD, but we are aware of many fine organizations across the globe driving initiatives within the US. There's Nimble, there's BTEC in North Carolina, and others within France. There's EASE in Strasbourg, there's Campus Digital Biotech, a new initiative that will be announced publicly shortly, I would imagine. And then, of course, there's many fine industry representative organizations like the ISPE, the PDA, who have been providing really high quality training initiatives over many, many years to the members. And again, the vendors also have a very strong training programs. So in conclusion then, always like to conclude with this slide and to try and personalize it a little bit. Those 6 individuals there are 14 and 15-year-olds. Each year we run a program for 14 and 15-year-olds within the secondary school system in Ireland to apply for essentially an internship within our facility. And it's great to meet them and hear their energy, and to talk to them about biopharma and to try and almost convince them that this is drive their motivations for a career in this sector. So in conclusion, the final 3 points: we're seeing strong global demand for biopharma talent, and that demand is increasing over the coming years due to the inherent growth in biopharma manufacturing, the complexity of that manufacturing, and very strong global trends. The most effective way to address it is that tripartite collaboration between industry, government, and academia. And really important that this is a long-term, holistic strategy with multiple programs across all levels and all demographics is required to ensure that their success in workforce development is sustainable. So forgive me, I ran a couple of minutes over there, but hopefully not too bad. And I will hand it back to our moderator at this stage. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Killian, for that great talk. So we've around 5 minutes for Q&A. So everyone, please submit your questions into the Q&A box there. And what we'll do is we'll try to get through as many as we can before we finish up. So the first question is for Eric, and it's from Volker Wagner, and he's asking, how is sustainability an important issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We looked at sustainability probably 10 years ago, and it did show up in our analysis. But over time, we realized that especially sustainability as it relates to single-use devices, I'm assuming you bring that up. These plastic devices obviously are, there's challenges with disposal, hazardous waste and so forth, and it's a lot of plastic. The challenge, of course, is how can you recycle these devices in a safe way. ISPE has a committee right now working with the vendors right now to solve that problem, and they're looking to identify ways to do it. But at present, the issue is, can a device be made, and can the process of recycling be done in a way that is going to be consistent with the requirements for quality in the devices and quality in the end product? That's going to be more critical.
Great. Sadhguru, he was more of an open comment, but he has 2 important trends in the pandemic are the need of continued manufacturing with minimum or no people, and the second point was untouched by hand manufacturing. How does this open up demand for increased robotics in biomanufacturing?
So maybe I'll take a start of that. So to date, we haven't seen are a wide-scale deployment of robotics within biopharma manufacturing, say beyond what, let's say, kind of traditional application of robotics in, say, kind of warehousing, for example. And the reason for that is because within biopharma manufacturing, it's not discrete manufacturing. There's a large amount of fluids, there's a large amount of kind of manual operations, there's a large amount of kind of bespoke work, particularly in the single-use system. So perhaps you could say is a somewhat a kind of a lack of standardization. Now, what we are beginning to see that change, and we have, for example, done some interesting work with Novartis, Lonza, and others to have essentially a robot act as your microbiologist and to put settle plates down around your labs and your pilot plant, and then to collect them and to bring them back to the lab for analysis. So we are beginning to see some application of robotics, but what I would say is not to the same extent that you would see in discrete manufacturing. But Eric, you might want to comment on that also.
Yeah, I think the issue, I think, also centers around continuous bioprocessing. Obviously, continuous bioprocessing is something of a long-term goal that the industry is seeking to achieve. There are unit operations that are being made continuous, like obviously like perfusion bioreactors, which have been around for decades. The question is, how do you connect the perfusion bioreactor to a harvest step or a downstream processing step? And yes, there are companies with novel technologies that we literally see every day coming out as innovative. The challenge, though, still remains the chromatography, or a challenge remains the chromatography step. And that's where robotics, I think, is going to be, and automation is going to take a real role. Because as you know, if you've got a handful of valves controlling two columns, then that's not so difficult. But when you add another column or a third or a fifth column, then it becomes increasingly difficult to manage the valves, because my understanding is that the number of valves and the processes increase almost geometrically as you do that, and that requires some real serious automation, obviously, and that is, of course, is going to open up the route for robotics. The question is, when will that technology be mainstream, something out of off the benchtop into a clinical, late-stage clinical, or even a commercial scale? And people have been saying that that's been 5 years ago. People said that will be here in 5 years. Today, people say that will be here in 5 years. The difference, though, between 5 years ago and today is that we're seeing many more perfusion bioreactors at many, many more facilities. And so the possibility of introducing these new technologies exists now where it didn't exist 5 years ago. So we would predict that the trend we're seeing in terms of increasing numbers of continuous products to accelerate, so that we'll have entirely different conversations in 5 years as it relates to continuous bioprocessing.
Right, okay. We're slipping out of time, but maybe you can answer a quick response to this last question from Philip. How are critical raw materials risk mitigated after COVID experience from a quality and supply chain perspective? Who would like to go first on this one?
I think that's one for you, Eric. Is that one for you, Eric?
Okay, I can take a stab at it. And actually, there's a number of pieces in there. One is the raw materials, and the other one is the supply chain and COVID. What we've seen in general is that the industry has not experienced significant quality issues, despite the increase in demand, partly because of stockpiling. And I don't think another thing we have not seen is price gouging or profiteering on the part of the suppliers. So I think what we're seeing is a fairly normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. And I think that goes to the issue of quality. The quality, I think, is that from what we've seen talking to end users, the issue of quality has not shown up in raw materials, at least not in a significant way that we've been able to detect.
Right. Right, well, guys, thank you very much for that. So we are out of time, unfortunately. So I want to give a big thank you to both Eric and Killian for taking their time today. It was very much appreciated to hear from them and grateful to get your insight and experience. To everybody else, you should receive a personalized kind of email within the next 24 hours with the link and the details of this on-demand webinar. So please feel free to share to anybody that hasn't wasn't able to join today. But look, thank you very much for joining and listening in. And look, I wish you all a very pleasant evening, morning, afternoon. And yeah, until next time, take care.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all.